Welcome to Two Bees in a Podcast, brought to you by the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. It is our goal to advance the understanding of honeybees and beekeeping, grow the beekeeping community, and improve the health of honeybees everywhere. In this podcast, you'll hear research updates, beekeeping management practices discussed, and advice on beekeeping from our resident experts, beekeepers, scientists, and other program guests. Join us for today's program, and thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast. In today's episode of Two Bees in a Podcast, we will be talking with Brooke Mathis, who is a county extension agent in Lake County, Florida. She's a specialist in landscaping for honeybees, so it doesn't matter where you are on planet Earth, you're going to want to listen to this because Brooke will give us some pointers on how to develop a landscape, including flowers and design that are appropriate for the honeybees that we know and love. Following that, Amy and I will be spending some time talking about beekeeping equipment. Just some of our opinions about how to use certain types of equipment, what types are better or worse, some pros and cons. You'll want to look forward to hearing that. And then finally, we will conclude this podcast with everyone's favorite Stump the Chump, our question and answer series. Brooke, it is fantastic to have you with us because you're going to be talking about gardening for bees.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on today.
Yes, it's our pleasure.
I'm so excited, Brooke. So Brooke is she was one of my mentors when I was in Orange County. So everything I know, I learned from Brooke.
So you guys have a history. So Brooke, is there some stuff I can ask you about, Amy? Because I'm sure you know some.
Absolutely, but we'll have to do it off the air.
No,
Okay,
I think, gosh.
No.
Maybe I should have spoken to you before she joined the team here.
Hey now. There's enough roasting of Amy. Okay, so let's get to the actual topic. So Brooke, I guess my question for you is, why should the average homeowner care about landscaping for bees and other wildlife? I know that I am a little biased and I love landscaping for bees and wildlife. BioLife. But why should we care? I mean, why should anyone care about landscaping?
Well, I'll tell you kind of how I got started into gardening. I've been a gardener since I was a teenager. I was exposed to gardening through my grandfathers. And I think one of the reasons I enjoy gardening so much is that it is time for me to commune with nature. And I really think that it is a time for me to press stop on the worries of daily life and just really take in the beauty of the natural world. And I've always been fascinated by insects because they're so tiny and they can be so complex. And honeybees are a really big part of this fascination because they're such social creatures. And when I commune with nature, I love to pay attention to these tiny little fascinating creatures. So I think honeybees and insects in general have a special place in my heart. But one of the reasons that it's important for really everyone to care about landscaping for bees and other wildlife too is that at least here in Florida, as an example, the urban landscape is one of our largest expanding land uses. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it is in many places in the world. And then when we have this mass expansion of urban landscapes, what we're losing is our woodlands, our pastures, and they're turning into urban yards. So when this happens, wildlife can be displaced. And it can be displaced greatly, but there's really a lot we can do in our home yards and in the urban landscape to provide for honeybees and other wildlife.
Yeah, I think that's like a great testimony. Honestly, I've been keeping bees since I was 12, so that's now 30 years ago. But landscaping for bees wasn't a big deal when I got into beekeeping. However, when I was hired at the University of Florida and bee populations started declining, and by the way, there's no correlation between the two of those. This idea of landscaping for bees just exploded. And so a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls that I was starting to get is like, what can I plant to help my bees? And from there, a lot of people are getting funded to study this. There's a lot of research projects on what you can plant in your home landscape to look at this. So it's exciting that you're embracing that and you're working with your clients here in Florida to discuss that. So let me ask you a question. What are some of the barriers the public may encounter when landscaping for honeybees and other wildlife? I have a sneaky suspicion I know some of those, but I'd love for you to share what you've learned about that.
Sure. So I think part of the public perception is simply that people think when you're gardening for wildlife or honeybees that the landscape is going to look messy and unkempt. But, there's things that you can do to help the landscape fit into those social norms. And I think sometimes you could have, if you're, landscaping for honeybees is a little bit easier, I think, to fit in some of those homeowner association covenants or property owner association covenants than maybe wildlife in general. So, sometimes those HOA covenants could be something to work around. But, if you can educate your HOA board or your property owner association board, then that can help too, if you live in an area where you have those types of restrictions. I think another thing could be plant availability. So sometimes our native wildflowers, which can be really great for attracting honeybees, can be hard to find at the big box stores, the typical retail garden center. But there are non-natives too, which can provide good pollen sources as well. But I think plant availability can be some of that. And then also, I think we also have to get away from the mindset of reaching for the pesticide bottle too. So you don't want to use pesticides, or you want to greatly limit your use of pesticides by doing things like choosing soaps and oils that don't have a long residual period. And then you also don't want to apply when bees are actively foraging, which is typically in the hot, sunny time of the day. So if any spraying needs to take place, you need to do so early in the morning or late in the evening. Another really important thing to do when if you are going to apply pesticides is make sure you avoid dust formulations, because they can be picked up on the hairs very easily of honeybees and some of our other bee species as well. So again, the public perception that it's going to look messy, we can get away from that. Plant availability, finding some of those native species or some of those hard to find non-natives, and then again, limiting your use of pesticides or getting away from them altogether.
Brooke, those are great comments. One of the things that I think about too, when I think about this particular question, is in my workings with not necessarily homeowners, but companies or offices that want to provide landscaping around their business or industry, et cetera. There's a little bit of fear that if you're planting these things and you're attracting bees, how dangerous is that, right? Everybody loves the idea of planting pollinator gardens if it means you're going to have a lot of butterflies, because butterflies can't, flap you to death. But people concern themselves. If I put all these plants,
did you just say flap you to death?
Well, how else is a butterfly going to kill you, Amy? I don't know what to say. but they're like, am I going to have bees in my backyard? We're talking about landscape. We could have another podcast about actually putting out nesting habitat, and then you will have bees nesting in the yard. So I think some fears associated with bees, and I would argue, Brooke, unwarranted fears, because when bees are out there on these flowers, they're just collecting nectar or pollen. They're not out to bother you. So it's neat that you can promote this idea of landscaping for bees and actually purposely wanting them to come into your yard.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like a little success, when you plant something to attract pollinators and you see that honeybee kind of land on your flower. It feels like a success. Who wouldn't want to have that?
It does. It does feel like a success. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jamie, about the fear of being stung by a bee or a honeybee, because I do hear that often. But, if you're not aggravating them, if you're not near the hive or they're not trapped, the likelihood of you being stung is very, very minimal. So, and you may want to chime in on that even further.
I agree completely with you. I personally have, landscaped for bees a little bit in my yard, and I've never been stung by my bees on my flowers. It's just not one of those things that's very common. It can happen, right? If you're out there grabbing flowers and cutting fresh flowers to bring inside, there's a risk, but I still say the risk is minimal versus the joy you get from seeing this diversity of not just, honeybees, but diversity of bees that will come to your yard.
Right. Absolutely.
Brooke, so I have a question for you. So when we're talking about landscaping, it seems like it's pretty intense, just everything that we need to think about and all the barriers when it comes to landscaping for honeybees. So what are your suggestions for steps that homeowners might be able to take to provide a bee habitat for them?
So it's really can be very, very simple. Okay, in the most simple terms, grow more flowers. Grow them in varying heights, varying widths, different varieties of flowers. That can help. Plant these flowers in sunny locations. Group these plants together. And one of the reasons you want to group them together so bees actually use less energy searching for plants. Another thing that I think is really interesting is when we think of pollinator plants, what color comes to your mind typically, or to most gardeners? And
I have like 3 colors in my mind right
do
now.
you?
Of course you do, Amy. Because I was going to say yellow. Was I right?
Well,
Yellow,
yellow's
yeah, yellow's a great one for honeybees, but a lot
That
of
means
people.
I'm wrong.
No, that is
The
good.
way,
thinking- I was
you're
thinking-
answering it means that I failed.
well, I was
Well,
thinking purple or red.
Okay, so red is one of the ones that I was kind of thinking of that the typical person thinks of, but yellow's another good one. But
You're weird, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks for reinforcing it.
but, a
Don't
lot
worry,
of
Jamie. You're okay too.
but a lot of pollinators can see red. Honeybees really don't see red, or it's not that attractive to them. So honeybees prefer what Jamie had mentioned, the yellows. They prefer whites, blues, and purple flowers. So think about that when you're selecting your flowers. Those are colors that they're more attracted to, and they're attracted to flowers that kind of are on that side of the UV spectrum, the light spectrum towards the UV side. So again, your white, your blues, your purples. Another thing you can do is you can plant umbel and daisy shaped flowers. So if you haven't heard the term umbel before, when I hear the term umbel, I think of the word umbrella. So think of flowers that provide this shape. So umbel-shaped flowers are things like, some people may be familiar with the species Queen Anne's lace. That's something that I was very familiar with growing up in Georgia and the Tennessee area. It grew native all along the pastures. But what this flower does is it forms into a large cluster. So it's tons of tiny little flowers that make up this large cluster, and it offers a platform for the bees to land on. So you want to think of flowers that kind of form an umbrella shape. Other ones can be dill and parsley, and some of those herb type plants, and then so then the daisy type flowers, you can get into things that are commonly grown throughout the world, like black-eyed Susans, and then we have something called blanket flower here in Florida, purple coneflower
we
as
love
well,
that.
can be
Yep.
attractive. Yeah. So those are some suggestions. Plant a lot of flowers, plant in a sunny location, and think of those colors: yellows, white, blue, purple.
I think that's cool, but Brooke, I think the coolest thing you've said so far is you grew up in Georgia. Where in Georgia are you from?
I am from Douglasville, Georgia, which is on the west side of Atlanta.
Sure.
So, and what's really funny is I started doing all of this distance education over the past few weeks because, we have to in this situation.
Sure.
And I had no idea that I still had a very strong Southern accent.
It's funny. Someone the other day when I was giving a online presentation with Zoom, and I know we're chasing rabbits, but our podcast listeners tend to permit us to do that. I was giving a group talk to some place, and I think Philadelphia, I forget, but it was using Zoom, and someone in the chat box said, "Are you the person who does the voiceover for Peyton Manning and his commercials?" So apparently
That is so funny.
apparently they are saying that I also have a Southern accent.
Jamie, I like how out of all of that Brooke just told us all these fabulous tips, and you're like,
well-
you're from Georgia? Me too.
Well, I'm from Georgia as well. So anytime someone's from Georgia, I was going to say, Brooke, you're doing so good in your interview, guys. I got to listen to you forever, but now I know why, because you're from the greatest
Yeah,
state in the
we've got
union.
that connection.
Well,
That's so funny.
let me continue to make the Floridians and the others who aren't lucky enough to be Georgians happy. All right, so Brooke,
Oh my goodness.
any tips you can offer to make a landscape for honeybees fit into a more traditional landscape?
Sure. Okay. So this is if you live in some place that has a property owners association or homeowners association where or they may just have a, how am I going to put this? A highly maintained expectation for the landscape. So these are things you can do if you live in one of those high maintenance areas. You can plant your like flowers together and plant them in mass. This not only helps your landscape appear more tidy, but it can help insects locate the food source. Another landscape tip that I think is really cool, but I don't know that the honeybees care so much about it, is planting in odd numbers versus even numbers. And this is
I was about to ask, how many is in mass? Like, how many would you say? 3, 5, 7?
Okay, so
9?
it all depends. All right. So one reason we say plant in odd numbers and not even numbers is because with odd numbers, if you look at the palm of your hand, your eye wants to rest on your middle finger. So your eye in the landscape wants to rest on something in the middle. And if you have four, it doesn't know where to rest. So this is just a basic landscape design tip. So if you have a tall, large, or an interesting plant, for example, here we have something called a weeping Yopon holly, which can provide flower resources and berries. But anyhow, it may be harder to find in other areas of the world. But anyway, it's got a very interesting habit. So we're only going to plant one of those. Medium-sized shrubs, you're going to plant in 3s, 5s, or 7s. And then, you want to pick medium-sized shrub that flowers heavily for those honeybees. And then wildflowers and perennials, plant 5s, 7s, 9s, or more, and kind of try to group them together. Now, another thing that can help if you're in a deed-restricted community or just an area where it's a highly maintained landscape is to have well-defined beds and use mulch in those well-defined beds. And I think that's one of those things that's like a social norm. For instance, in my home landscape, I have a turf grass that blends in with a wildflower species, and my neighbors don't really complain about it because my beds, I think, are really well-defined and my landscape is nicely maintained. So it seems to be okay in my neighborhood. And if it's not okay, they're not telling me about it. So then I'm okay,
sure.
right?
So you're just kind of like hiding it and defining different areas of your yard.
Yeah, you're almost like highlighting different areas and pulling the eye away. So anyhow, but you can also design your beds. And I think this works really well when you're working with wildflowers and those types of things that can have that appearance of being messy, or at least that perception of being messy. But if you design your beds in a natural flowing design, think about the path of a stream or maybe a woodland hiking trail, and you do like these kind of large curves, you're avoiding strong geometry. And I think a bee habitat or other type of pollinator habitat could look really messy and really weird if you put it in a landscape where you have a lot of strong geometry. So, because it looks formal, and then you have these plants that kind of have an informal, naturalistic look. Now, could it work? Yeah, somebody with a really keen eye for design could probably make that work, but I think the typical homeowner, if they're going to grow these types of plants and they want to grow wildflowers en masse, need to stick to naturalistic flowing beds.
So Brooke, this is fascinating to me. I totally want you to come design my landscape in my house.
Well, thank you.
I love that term, strong geometry. I feel like that'd be a great t-shirt.
Yeah. That's so funny. I'm looking at the palm of my hand right now, as you're talking about it. And I was thinking like Jamie probably looking at his pinky finger instead of his middle finger, but that's okay.
Actually, I took my socks off to see if it worked with my feet too.
That's not
I was
weird
drawn to the big toe. I don't know.
Okay, so we've already talked about landscaping and people with bigger yards and landscapes and, HOAs, things like that. But I'm wondering about residents who live with, either an apartment that has small lots or patios, or, they might not have any space at all. Is it still possible to attract bees, and how would we do that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we're going to have to do this for wildlife and for pollinators and honeybees. And I actually heard Jarrett Daniels, who's with the University of Florida, and he works with our butterfly museum. I was fortunate enough to hear him speak about attracting pollinators to the landscape. And he was saying 80% of U.S. citizens live in cities. And so we need to come up with ways to attract wildlife, even in our city type situations. And that can be easy to do with honeybees and small pollinators, right? So, a small patio or a small lot, even if you start small and you just increase your diversity of plant material, you're going to increase your diversity of pollinators. It's one of those things, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
And so you can always start small by just doing some container gardens or a small landscape bed if you're in a small lot, and just plant honeybee and butterfly plants. And I think it's really important to note that, even the smallest garden has a role to play, especially if we all do it collectively, right? So
I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that honeybees and other pollinators actually have more nectar and pollen resources in urban areas because of, interest in bringing pollinators, even when it's a concrete jungle. They're able to have flowering plants that are actually available and closer to them, in bigger areas. I don't know if it's true or not, or if I just totally made that up. That could have been it too.
Well, Amy, one of the I don't know if it's a wise tale or not, but one of the tales that you often hear is that you will hear that honeybees in cities will make more honey, not necessarily, but right maybe than agricultural areas, et cetera,
Sure.
because of the diversity of flowering
Mhm.
plants. And again, when I lived in Georgia, some Atlanta beekeepers made that claim. I've met with some beekeepers up in New York City who make similar claims. Maybe there's some truth to that, but I know, Brooke, you're absolutely right. Every one of us has a role we can play because we all have
Mhm.
something we can do, even if it's put, flowering plants that are attractive to bees in a pot. So that leads me kind of to the next question. So what plants attract honeybees?
Okay, well, again, quite simply, you can just grow more flowering plants and a huge diversity of flowers. Plant, native wildflowers to your area too. Think of daisy-shaped flowers. Again, those purple cone flowers. We have something in Florida called a blanket flower. Black-eyed Susans grow all over the place. So those are some of those daisy-shaped flowers. And then, of course, lots of fruit trees and vegetables as well. And we've got to have those pollinators to pollinate our vegetables and our fruit trees. So peaches, cucurbits like squash and cucumber, they'll go to those types of flowers as well. And then again, those umbel flowers, the dill, the parsley, the fennel. Another thing that I have noticed, and I'm not sure, I have to be honest, I'm not sure the research on this, but I have noticed that flowers that have a short throat, like a snapdragon, that I notice a lot of honeybees going to things like snapdragons and some of those flowers that have a throat. And then also a lot of your herbs, which is really, really nice, like basil, rosemary, and lavender, those are grown throughout the world, and they not only provide for pollinators, but they provide for us as well. You can spice up a dish or add some flavor to a dish with the leaves. So I really enjoy growing those types of plants. So, and actually at our Discovery Gardens, which is our UF-IFAS Extension Office demonstration garden here in Lake County, we are growing an edible landscape. So everything's either going to be edible or it's going to be a plant that attracts pollinators. So there will be some type of use for every single plant in that landscape. So I'm really excited. We just broke ground on this garden, and anyway, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Brooke,
And,
I was gonna say, I've always loved the idea of edible landscapes. A lot of people don't think about it, but even shrubs can be, edible. Like here in the southeastern U.S., we've got blueberries that can make good hedgerows if you cultivate them appropriately. So this idea that you can actually, plant everything that you can plant can have a table function, as it were, and still be beneficial for bees is a really neat concept, I think.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And not every plant will have out there will be edible, but at least it will serve the purpose of attracting pollinators if it's not edible, so that we can
Yep.
help get those species pollinated.
Absolutely. I'll make a couple comments here, with regard to gardening for pollinators. So I travel quite a bit, and I'm in Europe a fair amount, maybe a few times every year. And one of the cool things, of course, Europeans, especially the British, take gardening very seriously. I did a sabbatical in Germany few years ago and spent 6 months there, and the Germans were very similar in this regard. They just have such nice, pristine yards. They use the word garden to describe a yard. We use the word yard. They use the word garden. You go into their gardens and there's just flowers everywhere. They're stratified. They flow. Like you mentioned, there's also usually a diversity of colors. And oftentimes when I think gardening here at my own home, I kind of, take a lot of inspiration for what I've seen a lot overseas. And when we specifically now kind of segueing to this little last thing I'll mention, when we talk about plants that attract honeybees, what I will tell beekeepers, and even what I've done in my own yard, is ask yourself, what are the major nectar and pollen plants that honeybees use in your area? And then consider putting them in your yard. Not only will that attract honeybees to your yard, but it will also let you know when those things are in bloom in your area. To give you an example, our yard does not have saw palmetto and gallberry. For the rest of the world, those of you listening, those are very important honey plants in north central Florida. So what I did is I put gallberry and saw palmetto in my yard, and now when I see them in bloom in my yard, or budding in my yard, I can anticipate the coming nectar flow. So, what do your bees make honey on in your area? Plant those things in your yard, not because you believe that they're going to use that 1 or 2 or 3 shrubs or trees in your yard to make a whole, hive full of honey, but just so that you can use it to see when it comes into bloom, when bees are going to it, and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, Jamie. And what was funny that you mentioned the saw palmetto and the gallberry. I actually had that on a list of Florida plants for honeybees. So, and one of my favorite honeys is actually gallberry honey.
Yeah, gallberry is divine.
Oh, isn't it? And it's hard to find.
Yeah, it is increasingly harder to find. But around the world, people have similar plants. Everywhere I travel, I see honeybees on certain plants. I'm like, hey guys, this would be great in your landscape. It's beautiful. It's native. It'll grow well under the conditions that you have here. And I think, Brooke, all of your recommendations were so insightful. It seems clear to me that you've actually been doing this for a while. I mean, the only way this could be better is if you told me you went to the University of Georgia.
Oh, I did
So
not.
don't let me down, okay? If you didn't, just don't tell me you didn't.
Okay, gotcha.
Well,
Just
and
no comment.
the best part of having Brooke on this is that she's a county agent, and really everywhere around the nation here in the U.S. People should be able to find their local extension agent. And, even if their agent doesn't really not even understand, but doesn't know the answer to some of their questions, they have available resources to back them up. And they know who, they know people. So, thank you so much, Brooke.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been great to have you. I mean, you did such a good job. I'm like wondering what other topics we can talk to you about in the future. So, Brooke, thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Have a great rest of the day.
Absolutely. Guys, that was Brooke Moffett. She joined us on Two Bees in a Podcast. She's a commercial horticulture and Florida-friendly landscaping agent for the UF IFAS Extension Office in Lake County, Florida. Thank you for joining us for this segment of Two Bees in a Podcast.
Have questions or comments? Don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at UF Honeybee Lab.
In this segment of the podcast, we are going to be talking about equipment. We have been receiving a lot of questions about equipment and, things that are better than others. So I'm going to interview Jamie today, and he's going to let us know what he thinks about some of the equipment things. And whether purple hives are better than black hives or better than white hives, I'm not sure. But
White hives,
we'll
that's
find
the
out.
way to go for sure.
That's fair. With little swirlies and spirals and smiley faces painted on them.
That's all outside of my wheelhouse, though, Amy. I hope the questions are more straightforward than that.
Yeah, so we actually have a listener. He lives in Orlando in the area, and his name is Bob Porter. Just give a little shout out. And he sent us an email with really great questions with equipment. So we figured we'd just do a segment on this and see, if we can answer some of his questions, and hopefully listeners will listen in. And if they have other questions, they can feel free to email us and ask us on Facebook. What do you think?
Well, great. This basically is an expanded Q&A to focus on only one topic, beekeeping equipment, which is why we've made it a segment rather than just part of our Stump the Trump. Stump the Trump. That just seems so appropriately these days. I'm not making a political statement, but it's hard to say up without saying truh, right?
That was pretty good. We're gonna keep that.
Chump. My wife laughs at me all the
Stump
time.
the chump.
Stump the chump. Why can't I do this? Okay, that's why I'm the chump.
Okay.
I think I have a.
Let's talk about equipment. Let's talk about equipment, Jamie.
Rescue me before it's too late, please.
That's fair. Okay, so when you're selecting woodenware, what do you look for? Is traditional pine better than cypress or cedar, or are there synthetic hive bodies?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of information, right? So historically, beekeeping equipment has been made from pine, some sort of pine. And pine's a perfectly fine wood. I'm not knocking it at all. It's standard. It weathers the storm pretty well. There are other woods that have been used for beekeeping equipment. I have seen some cedar. Where I'm from, there's a lot of cypress grown. So cypress is a very common wood to be used in woodenware. So let's just talk about the wood first, then I'll get into some of these other materials. First of all, I have personally always favored cypress, and I'm not trying to give endorsements or shout outs here, but the issue is that cypress is naturally a rot and pest organism. Yeah, I know I'm struggling today. It's because I'm in my closet trying to record this. But cypress is historically a pest and rot resistant wood. Now, a lot of people, I mentioned that too, point out to me that that is true of old growth cypress and not necessarily the younger cypress that's out there. And a lot of the cypress that's being sold in beekeeping as beekeeping equipment is some of the younger growth. But nevertheless, I still prefer cypress to pine, but I will regularly use pine. I'll use cedar. Cedar tends to be a little bit more. So generally speaking, the type of the wood is a little less important, than how you prepare it. And what I tell people is it's really protecting that wood that's going to ensure the longevity of that woodenware. So let me give you an example. When I put together hive boxes or hive bodies or supers, etc., I never use nails. I always use screws, right? Screws are better fasteners. I always use wood glue at the joints. I also always caulk the joints once I've assembled the box. So I'll caulk the joints on the outside, I'll caulk the joints on the top of the box and the bottom of the box, and then I paint it with multiple layers of paint. So all of these can extend the life of, even a pine box for some length of time. There was always a question about whether or not you should treat with wood preservatives. The copper naphthenate is really the only one that's recommended for use in beekeeping equipment these days. I personally do not treat my woodenware. I have some data that suggests that there might be some impacts of that stuff on bees, but nevertheless, I'm pretty convinced that if you keep it painted, keep the corners caulked and put everything together with wood glue, that it'll have a long life. Now, you asked also, Amy, about these other types of materials that are used to build beekeeping equipment. The common ones are a hard plastic or polystyrene. And so just very quickly about those, the plastic boxes are great. They don't rot. They tend to last into perpetuity if you take care of them right. The catch with both those and the polystyrene boxes is that they hold moisture. So as bees consume honey, as they live in their boxes, they produce a lot of moisture, and that stuff can collect on the walls of the boxes and rain down on them. So they don't, quote, breathe quite as well. But both materials are very sturdy and can last a very long time and are an important part of a lot of beekeepers' operations. They tend to like those rather than even using wood.
So what about the different grades of wood? So does it matter if you're going to pay more for, fancier wood at all?
Yeah, essentially, Amy, the big deal about the grades of wood are really boiled down to how many knots and splits are in the wood when you purchase it. So the highest grade, the best wood, has no knots or splits in it, and a lot of people tend to prefer that. But I will tell you that when they are the second tier or third tier type woods and they contain knots or splits, those are almost always in areas that aren't the joints. In other words, areas that don't really matter a lot. When they're making those boxes, they'll cut around those things and not include them in the delicate places. So buying that second, third tier of wood is a good way to save on equipment costs. But I will tell you, it might take a little bit of extra protection. There might be cracks that you need to fill in with wood putty, as an example. And you'll want to make sure that you caulk and paint and all that stuff. So I worry less about the grade of the wood, and typically will accept second and maybe even third tier wood just to save on costs, especially if I was buying, thousands of boxes to assemble.
Yeah, so you're talking about painting, and so one of his questions was actually whether it's worthwhile to wax coat and paint, or just paint, versus staining. So is there something that you recommend for that?
Yeah, this wax coating thing has become very popular, and for our listeners, what that means is beekeepers will melt, a large vat of beeswax, and they'll quickly dip their boxes in those either before or after.
I've seen that, I think.
Or they'll paint it on the walls. The idea that natural beeswax gives it that added layer of protection. I have never done that. I have never personally dipped my boxes in wax, and I've always had boxes last a very long time. And I'm just a firm believer in gluing, caulking, and painting, and that seems to last a while. But the wax thing is intriguing to me. I think it cannot hurt, but I hesitate to recommend dipping with wood preservative, the copper naphthenate that I mentioned earlier. Remember, I will tell you, not all wood stains are for use with bees. So you really need to make sure you're using stains that are acceptable.
Okay, so what I want to do, because Bob's questions are, he talks about the woodenware, then he talks about covers, and then screen bottom boards. So let's go with the screen bottom boards next.
Sure thing.
So what are the advantages of using a screen bottom board versus a solid or traditional bottom board?
So that's a great question. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia, screen bottom boards were just coming out and being studied. So what are they? So essentially, your hive has to rest on something. It's either going to be resting on a solid bottom board, which is basically a solid piece of wood or multiple pieces of wood put together to make a solid surface, or it's going to be resting on a screen bottom board. And a screen bottom board is a bottom board that instead of wood has screen. And those became popular because some scientists at the time had hypothesized that perhaps as bees groomed themselves during the day, varroa would fall off of them through the mesh and to the ground, not able to return back to the bees in the hive. And so the idea is that maybe it lowered varroa populations. So there was some research done, a decade now, 15 years, I guess, ago. And what they showed is that colonies that have screen bottom boards actually have lower varroa populations. Now, I don't believe that it is thought that that is due to grooming behavior any longer. I think that they have other reasons for believing that varroa populations are lower in colonies with screen bottom boards. But nevertheless, they are lower in colonies that have screen bottom boards. And I think a review of the literature that was conducted about 10 years ago showed that colonies with screen bottom boards have somewhere between 10 and 15% fewer varroa than colonies with solid bottom boards. So
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, the thing is it's not like a huge flip of the switch, right? You get some varroa control, but not complete. But it may mean the difference between you having to treat 3 times this year and only having to treat twice. Maybe that reduction in 10 to 15% is enough to limit your treatment, or maybe it amplifies the impact of other treatments. There are some other touted benefits. It's been shown that colonies might have more brood or more bees, but I think it's really negligible changes in that. The real issue is that it was supposed to impact varroa populations. And
That's
my point
so crazy.
is,
I thought that it was, honestly, I thought it was because of temperature and humidity.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's ventilation, but it really was born out of varroa control. And the thing is, Amy, is even if it's only a negligible or a minor impact on varroa, but not a negative impact on the colony, then why wouldn't you use them, right? The idea here is that I always tell people is, there's no known negative impacts associated with using it. And we know that there's a few, minor positive impacts. So why not use them? A lot of commercial beekeepers have been a little reluctant to embrace them because it would have required, modifying the pallets their colonies sit on and things like that. But at the end of the day, screen bottom boards are really useful for a lot of hobbyists. And one last point about them before we move on to the lid question that you have for me is, a lot of people get concerned that using screen bottom boards in colder climates is a problem because they're concerned that, it's going to be an issue for bees trying to keep their nests warm. So if that is the case with you, you can still use screen bottoms. But when winter approaches, you can just slide a piece of wood under the hive during winter to essentially close off that screen bottom board. I even know people who, those plastic cardboard signs that those political signs that you see posted on the set, it's made out of plastic, but it's made to look like cardboard. A lot of people will cut those to slide into the entrance of a hive to cover that screen bottom board during the winter. I personally don't do that. I didn't do it when I lived in Georgia, and the nighttime temperatures would get.
Well, that's not north, Jamie.
Yeah, I know. That's why I said the word Georgia. I wanted to give everybody living north of Georgia the okay to slide something in the hive to close off those screen bottoms. Just make sure when you do it, you don't close the hive entrance.
Yeah, and typically the screen bottom boards, when you purchase them, I think they come with a little sliding bottom cardboard slit, usually for like varroa.
Yeah, a lot of those do. And if you're worried, you can close those off during winter. I personally don't worry, but I also live in Florida.
That's fair. Okay, so what about covers? What about the different covers? Tell us about those. And, is there any type of cover that you think is a little bit more, has an advantage over another?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 main types of covers. The first of those is called telescoping covers. The other is a migratory cover, migratory lid. The cover or lid are both interchangeably used. So a telescoping cover is the traditional cover, and it's usually a wooden cover that's got a metal sheet that goes around the top of it. You put it on top of the hive, and it goes past the edges of the super and down the walls of the super just a little bit. It's telescoping, right? The problem with telescoping covers is that they tend to be more expensive than migratory covers. I'll tell you why in a moment. But they also require a second cover, which is called an inner cover. And the reason for that is that telescoping cover comes off of the edges of the boxes and down the sides. And so as a result, if you only use a telescoping cover, the bees might glue the frames in the uppermost box to that cover, and you can't put your hive tool in there to pop those frames loose when you're trying to take off the telescoping cover. So when you use a telescoping cover, you have to also use an inner cover. So long story short, it requires you to buy 2 pieces of equipment. I will tell you, I like the old-fashioned way of beekeeping. I use telescoping covers because I think they're just cool and make a hive look better. But for a lot of commercial beekeepers, they're not very practical. Number one, they tend to be more expensive. Number two, the migratory lids that they use, I'll tell you about in a moment, have a provision to feed bees through the migratory lid. And number three, the telescoping lids, if you think about them, if they're going over the edges of the boxes and down the walls just a hair, you can't stack hives side by side on a trailer because there's the gap between the hives created by the 2 telescoping lids touching one another. So they prefer to use migratory covers because it's a single piece of equipment. Doesn't usually require construction because it's just, a rectangle that fits flush on the uppermost box. So it's cheaper. You can stack boxes side by side because the lids don't telescope. And also, many of them, most of them, in fact, have a hole in the middle to accommodate a feeder jar. So people who use the telescoping and inner covers typically do it just because that's what's in the starter kits. It's the old school way of doing things. They're pretty. They also are heavier, so they tend to stay on colonies and storms. But the real benefit goes to migratory covers because they're just practical. They're cheap, easy to feed through, and you can stack boxes close together. At the end of the day, though, Amy, I'll tell you, we've talked about what to make your boxes out of. We've talked about bottom boards. We've talked about covers. But at the end of the day, everything related to all of that stuff is opinion. If you like telescoping covers, go with it. If you like migratory covers, go with them. If you like solid bottoms or screen bottoms, it doesn't matter. The key here is use what's convenient for you and protect it by assembling it appropriately, painting it, and making sure that you're able to extend its life through this, regular care.
Awesome. Well, thanks for answering those. And Bob, thanks for sending us an email with all those questions. That was great.
It's everybody's favorite game show, Stump the Chump.
All right, it's time for that question and answer time. Jamie, I've got 3 questions for you.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it.
They're all random questions, so we'll just start from the beginning.
Well, I'll give you random answers then.
Great. Okay, so in our first question, someone named Bob, he just placed his hives on his property, and within hours, by the end of the day, there were beetles already in the hive. Have you ever observed this behavior, and how did those beetles find the hive so quickly?
Yeah, so a couple comments related to that. Number one, it's possible that there were beetles already in the hive, and just by virtue of moving the colonies, that became apparent. I think in this particular individual's case, in Bob's case, he had mentioned moving his hives to an area and then very quickly thereafter seeing beetles fly into it. And I think in that regard, it is very possible, number one, beetles likely find colonies using olfactory cues. That means they can smell colonies. So I think this really kind of comes to a greater question, which is, if there were no bees here in the first place, why, when I move my bees there, do beetles come in relatively quickly? And I would argue that if beetles are present, then that's evidence that there are bees there in the first place. There are probably some feral colonies nesting nearby. It's also possible that there are other beekeepers in the area, even if he's unaware of those beekeepers. Another thing worth considering is that beetles fly incredibly well. We're not exactly sure what their whole range is. We've done some work with some colleagues from the Netherlands to look at that, and we know they can fly many kilometers, many miles in an evening. So we know they're capable of flying relatively reasonable distances. So it's possible that they were just beetles emerging nearby other colonies and surrounding environment, and they were host seeking, and now his colonies are the new colonies in town. So they found his hives. I would argue that in most cases, perhaps it wouldn't be that quick, but it is certainly within the realm of things that are possible for beetles to do. So I'm not surprised to hear this at all.
That's interesting. I know you did part of your PhD work on beetles, right?
That's right. My entire PhD dissertation was on small hive beetles, and when I did my work in South Africa. But we never looked at their flight capacity. And as I mentioned, I've got a Dutch colleague, Bram Corneliussen, who's interested in looking at that and has done some work in our lab on that. But we're still processing the results. I'm a little anxious about suggesting how far they're capable of flying. We just saw them capable of doing it for what I would consider a great distance. So when that comes out, I'll be a little bit more comfortable talking about that specifically. But I will tell you, they do fly. And imagine a situation where beekeepers were 2 miles away. They left their colonies there for 2 months. Beetles, moved out of their colonies, are pupating in the ground, and the beekeeper moves his or her colonies away. Well, these beetles that come up now have no colonies, and so they go host seeking. And so there's lots of scenarios that could have led to what Bob saw with his colonies. And it's just not surprising that beetles are prolific flyers and can go where they want.
Awesome. We'll have to do another podcast segment on a hive beetle sometime.
Yeah, I think it would be good for people. Love to talk about beetles.
Yes. Okay. So for our second question, there was an inquiry about small cell foundations. So can you tell me a little bit about these?
Yeah, just a brief background about it. There were some beekeepers some years ago who really got into small cell foundation. And the idea is this, that you can use foundation that has smaller cell sizes. So when the bees build the comb on it, those cells then have a smaller than typical cell size. And this was based on the idea of some measurements made on the cell size of bees nesting naturally. And they saw that it was smaller than what the foundation size is that we typically use. And so that led them to say, well, hey, if bees naturally make smaller diameter cells, maybe we should give them that opportunity and see what that does. And so some foundation mills started producing what we call small cell foundation. Now, the catch is that a lot of the anecdotes related to small cell foundation preceded the science. Very quickly, people who were using small cell were making claims that they had fewer varroa, less this, less that. Their colonies were living better, making more honey, all these claims that at the time were unsubstantiated. So like it often does, it took the science a little bit of time to catch up. And my own wife did a project on small cell. There were 3 or 4 other labs around the country who did some research on small cell. And to make a long story short, there was no single benefit that we could find to using small cell foundation or making smaller combs. And so while it does not appear to be taxing to the bees, it doesn't appear to do any of these things that people are touting it to be capable of doing. Now, that said, it's possible that there'll be new benefits found in the future, but at the moment, at least our research, we were looking specifically at varroa, and we found no benefit related to varroa. And so a lot of beekeepers have kind of swung away from that. At the moment, at the time, a lot of commercial beekeepers were toying with getting into it, and our research and the research of others kind of suggested that it wasn't worth the effort. Again, it wouldn't hurt your bees. It's a investment because you've got these bigger bees on your bigger foundation and bigger combs that you have to transition to these smaller combs. And there's actually a step down process to get them to those small cells. And again, to make a long story short, it just doesn't seem to be worth it at the end of the day. Now, if you've already got small cell, there's no harm in doing that, but that doesn't mean your bees are going to be healthy. You'll still have to look at varroa and these other issues to make sure they don't pop up.
Sure. And side question, are the worker bees that come out of those small cells smaller?
They are, in fact, smaller. It appears that bees, when they grow up in a restricted environment, that does, in fact, affect the size. And we don't know how. I do write the question and answers column for the American Bee Journal. It's called The Classroom. And I had someone ask me if what's the trigger for larvae to stop feeding. In other words, if they grow up in small cells or large cells, how come they're bigger or smaller? Mm-hmm. And I kicked that idea around to a couple colleagues, and the best idea I heard is that when larvae have grown to reach the cell capacity, in other words, they've grown to the point where they touch the walls of the cell, it is possible that is a trigger to them to stop feeding, or it's possible that that's a trigger to the workers who go into that cell to stop providing food. So, that question of why bees are smaller in small cells and bigger in big cells, it would be a great question for some master student to try to address someday.
Yeah, I think it's so awesome that your wife was a honeybee researcher at one point too. Do you have your kids working on literature reviews right now?
There's a story related to that, Amy. Well, the issue is that we both went to the University of Georgia. My undergrad's in biology, hers is in wildlife biology. I went off to Rhodes University in South Africa to do my PhD in entomology. I came back home, got married to her, took her with me, and she did her master's while I did the second half of my PhD. And her master's is in wildlife biology or zoology, so it's consistent with her undergrad. Well, when we came home to the States, I was doing a postdoc at the University of Georgia. She got a job working, and she just decided that she liked school so much better than working that she decided to get her PhD. And she had already done all the wildlife classes that UGA had offered. So she's like, well, I don't really want to get a PhD in wildlife biology. I've kind of learned that stuff. So I guess I'll choose insects since that's what you do. And I guess I'll choose bees since I don't really like any of the other insects. So long story short, she just kind of fell into it by default, not necessarily out of a passion. But she has a PhD with honeybees as well. But it's not necessarily her passion. It's
sure.
More of I would rather be in school than be working, and I might as well just do this.
That's fun. That's a good place to be. It's pretty.
But it does mean that she can understand everything I do. So I don't have to, when I come home in the evening, I'm not having to explain my job to her. She's obviously very understanding and intelligent girl. She's perfect and beautiful in every way, of course.
Amanda, you're awesome. Okay.
Well, the thing is, Amy, she doesn't listen to the podcast.
Oh man. Well, great. That's
I
fine.
Can be honest either way and completely protected.
Okay. So for our third question that we have, what is the best way to move frames in a hive without accidentally crushing the queen?
Great question. So what I do is I will always go into a hive and remove the second frame from the wall nearest where I am standing. So I tend to work my hives from the side. And so if you number the frames 1 to 10, starting at you and moving away from you, I would remove the second one. I kind of lightly pry it loose and slowly lift it up, trying to stay centered. Then I will put that frame outside of the hive while I work the remainder of the frames. And because of doing that, I've always got a 1 frame space in my hive that I'm working, which allows me to go to frame 3 and kind of pop it towards me, work it, put it back down, and then go to frame 4 and pop it towards me and work it and put it back down. A lot of beginners think that you take out a frame, look at it, put it back in, and move to the next frame. And that increases your chances of damaging the queen. So I like to have that 1 frame space. Another thing that I do, and this will probably raise some hairs in some people, is I tend to keep 9 frames in 10 frame boxes, which allows me that extra space even in the brood chamber. So basically I have 1 frame space distributed over the remaining 9 frames, which allows me a little bit more space in my particular box. I'm not necessarily advocating or not advocating that, but it's just what I do.
Sure. Let's be honest here. How many queens have you smushed in your lifetime?
I've probably worked thousands upon thousands of colonies, and I've probably been responsible for the death of a queen or 2 in that time. These days, it really never happens. I'm pretty good at not doing that.
Awesome. All right. So those are our question and answers for today. Thank you.
Thank you guys for asking. Keep asking those questions on social media. It's a great way to get a hold of us, and we will do our best to answer it here on 2 Bees in the Podcast.
We'd like to give an extra special thank you to the following. To our editors, Shelby Howell and Bailey Carroll, and to our audio engineer, James Weaver. Without their hard work, 2 Bees in a Podcast would not be possible. So thank you.
For more information and additional resources for today's episode, don't forget to visit the UF-IFAS Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory's website, ufhoneybee.com. Do you have questions you want answered on air? If so, email them to honeybee@ifas.ufl.edu or message us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at UF Honeybee Lab. While there, don't forget to follow us. Thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast.